As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me, us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of The Malcolm Effect. This episode has been one in the making for quite some time. I am honored and privileged to be speaking to someone I consider an old school friend, Khalil Dewan. Welcome to The Malcolm Effect. Assalamu alaikum, and how are you?
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you very much for inviting me on. It's an honor, and yeah, it's true. It's been a very long time indeed. I think at least 2 years
Exactly, at
since
least.
inviting me. Yeah, indeed.
No, thank you. And also joining me today, who's actually going to be taking more of the hosting role, a voice you're familiar, a friend and comrade, Aden. Okay, so your work has been one of fascination for me for quite some time, and particularly in the context of the genocide taking place, Israel's genocide against the Palestinians. This topic is a recurring theme because somehow your work of drones and somehow the language around drones seems to present a more humane face of combat, a more humane face of law. So before we get into the specifics, I guess somewhat personal question that kind of helps contextualize your work. How did you even get into like discovering or working with or researching and talking about drones and drone warfare?
No, indeed. Well, first, with regards to the global war on terror, I started researching secret prisons where torture was taking place under the American administration in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and in a very short time, I found myself whereby my own brother-in-law was killed in an American drone strike.
Oh wow, subhanAllah.
Um, so that kind of was a segue for me to effectively, I was taken back by it, but in the same time, I was interested to understand how he was killed and what is the modality of a targeted killing, and was it lawful, was it not lawful? And there's a huge history which is subject to my thesis, where I investigate the British drone program in depth. But from around 2010, I was researching drones. I started off with the Awlaki v. Obama case, where Awlaki was killed in Yemen. And then I went on to do some more investigations in Syria, um, um, in more detail. And I actually did field work in Somalia, where I uncovered 14 civilian casualties. And in 2021, we also did some field work in Mali with the French drone program, where I learned a lot about kind of France's surveillance and drone-led strikes against a wedding party in Bunti. And that was really interesting because there was a lot of denials and so on and so forth. And then after doing field work and researching in different capacities for nearly 15 years now, I decided to bring all of my experiences as a human rights investigator to academia so I can reflect more deeply. But also, I chose to do it on the British drone program because it was quite untouched. And being British myself, I thought it would be a good idea, and I have some personal reasons to do it. And I had access to families who have been impacted by drone targeted killings abroad. So I've interviewed up to 20 families who have had people killed, and I go into an interesting debate regarding international human rights law and with critical approaches, decolonial approaches, as well as vigorous legal ones as well.
Thank you so much for that answer. I guess a technical question, and I'm not entirely making this podcast or interested in talking about the mechanics of drones, but maybe some people just might know. Like, if someone was to ask you what is a drone, how would you respond?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a drone is usually called unmanned aerial vehicle, or more commonly as a drone. And effectively, it's a remote control plane. And more accurately, the US government, they call it a piece of fiberglass, quote unquote. So it's just a piece of fiberglass which has missiles on it. which is controlled on the ground, not necessarily in the same domain or the same country it's hovering over, but it could be, around the world. So, for example, in America, drone pilots are controlling a drone over Iraq, Afghanistan with a relay. For example, in Germany, so that same signal is being relayed. And effectively, it does a lot of ISR, intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance for hours on end, and it finds targets in two ways. Number one, they have dynamic targeting, where they're conducting the surveillance, and they may find patterns on the ground, or they may be tracking SIM cards, and they'll strike that particular individual or group of individuals. And then the second way is they actually have a kill list involved. So they have people they want to take out, and they're proactively tracking them from A to Z, and they'll strike whenever they feel there is a concrete, specific imminent threat, or a threat has materialized to a threshold where they think they can quote unquote neutralize the target, or the Americans call it bug splat. So when they kill someone in the global south, they call it a successful bug splat. So that's effectively what a drone in very simple terms.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much once again. We understand Obama's presidency. For me, I believe it is one of the most harmful presidencies in terms of what it did to Black folks. So just for reference, we know that Black folks in America were amongst the faction that was the most anti-war consistently. And we know that under Obama, that changes, right? So we know that one of the functions that Obama served is to provide a humane face to empire, a humane face to the death and destruction of US imperialism. And we know particularly one of the ways in which that was enacted materially was through the advancement of the drone program under Obama. People often talk about, George Bush took us to war with Iraq and Afghanistan, all these places, or people talk about Trump. But again, because Obama can have somewhat of a good jump shot and listen to Kendrick Lamar, people will overlook that, or the destruction that he wrought across the world. And again, as I often say to folks, you have to look at the foundations that are being laid that enable what is to come next. You do not get a Trump if you don't have an Obama. But I want to speak specifically about Obama and his drone policy. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, you make a good point actually, and there's two words that come to mind: just liberal violence. Three words. Well, because Obama's strikes on the data, according to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which is a British outfit which tracked the drones from the Bush era to the Obama era, it multiplied by 10, particularly in Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen. So, whilst he is kind of idealized as the bastion for justice and progress, he has conducted more extrajudicial killing. These are killing of people without any trial, without any evidence of whether they've done something wrong. And it's very important to note that he's killed people outside of a armed conflict or outside of a war zone. So basically, you're killing people outside of a war zone in marketplaces or in land that Western think tankers and colonizers will call ungoverned spaces. And they think it's fair game to strike because there's no adequate government there. So effectively ramping up the strikes, killing people left, right, and center, and playing whack-a-mole. In fact, some of the US war jurists call it whack-a-mole in some of their reflective legal articles. So, in terms of Obama's role in the US drone program, that is what it is. And then you touched upon colonialism. It's really interesting because part of my journey in researching drones, I reached out to former US drone pilots and intelligence analysts, a number of them actually, and around 4 or 5 of them now are very good friends of mine. And I've been speaking to them since 2015. Mm-hmm. And I literally just spent time with them last month in Germany. And one of the things they said to me is that when they were training to be part of the drone program, they were not, the first thing they were trained was how they were going to control the savages and how they were going to, and wow. their mission was one of control rather than a security thing, right? A security measure. So when I was first studying this thing and this area, I wasn't really paying too much attention to that because, as most people think, colonialism has ended. But the reality is, this is a drone program which began in 2000. 2001, sorry. So, moving forward, they're being trained before 2001 and they're being told to think of the others in this way. Even from the language they use, like bug splat, so on and so forth. Even, for instance, like drone pilots, they would tell me that they would consider anyone dressed in Afghanistan like a Talib. And we all know they wear their shalwar kameez and occasionally they may wear a thobe or even a hat, which is very common across the Middle East and also in North Africa with some differences. But nonetheless, military-aged males, what that means is anyone dressing as a military-aged male looking like a Muslim is targetable. And then we can talk about that more with regards to drone targeting and who is targetable.
Honestly, that's incredible when I hear that, right? And for me, I don't think you can separate the progression and advancement of drone warfare from the stage of liberalism we're at right now, right? Wherein maybe more ostensible, quote unquote, ostensible, like on the ground invasion is perhaps seen as more unsavory when we think of the legacies of the Iraq War, etc., the afterlives of Iraq and Afghanistan. Somehow, the more humane way of doing things and understand and engaging in war is drones, right? And I think that's why it's important that we speak about the reality of drones. It's of course not more humane. But I will pass on to Aden. Please go ahead.
Salam Khalil. You've kind of generally outlined, but I just want to ask you for you to expand more on a general explanation of how drone warfare has affected modern warfare. For example, you mentioned in the training the use of the word savages, the use of drone names being predator, and so on and so forth, really resembling a kind of hunt. And what does this implicate for warfare, asymmetrical warfare, and so on and so forth?
Oh, yeah, exactly. And to be honest with you, drone warfare, well, first and foremost, drone warfare, the intersection of changing character warfare comes into this discussion prevalently in the literature, but also like in journalism, we've seen the impact of drone warfare. So there is this misnomer whereby there is no boots on the ground for drone warfare to effectively be launched and conducted properly. The reality is there's a lot of individuals on the ground working as spies and so on and so forth, supporting locational intelligence of people or high value targets to strike. So there's a lot of spies, a lot of moles, and also intelligence personnel, Western personnel, and a lot of literature from Afghanistan in particular, particularly localized literature and commentary have noted that for a long time. But drone warfare in and of itself has changed the character of war. So now you have an air force effectively remotely taking place. So you can have someone called Charlie literally waking up in the US, being dropped off by his wife to work, and he goes into a cabin for 12 hours on end doing his shift work, taking out a list of codes that he doesn't know what they've done. But whenever he wants to take a strike, he will literally ask the legal advisor and they will have an enabling posture to execute the strike, and then they'll kill and he'll do that. To give you a live example, if on mission, one pilot told me in the US drone program in particular, that he did his mission and it was time for him to come home, as in fly the plane back home, if you like, the UAV. So he contacted command and he said, I'm ready to come home, just getting your sign off. And he effectively, what was asked of him is, how many missiles do you have left? Please confirm. He said 2. And command said, well, release them and come home. And he said, well, there's no targets. The reality is the drone program is about striking and killing. And the whole point is that it's remote. Who's looking, who's asking questions. There's a lack of transparency, lack of accountability. There's a lot of lawfare with regards to the justifications of killing individuals just because the government states that they're in self-defense or they're taking care of imminent threats or concrete specific and imminent threats doesn't necessarily mean that is the case. Who's kind of looking at what's happening in the tribal areas of Afghanistan or Pakistan or Yemen? And the live genocide that we see in Gaza is a complete new layer to targeted killings. It's kind of shifted the entirety of the debate, and not just the debate, but the pragmatic approach we should take on drones with regards to killing. And I may sound that I'm very against drones. I'm not. After studying it for so long, I'm not necessarily against drone as a modality of killing. There can be legal and lawful strikes inside and outside of kind of war theaters, right? But we must understand that in the totality, we have to be pragmatic in that these new technologies, emerging technologies, as well as AI, is the future of warfare. And it's not something we're going to succeed in grounding. There's a lot of campaign groups out there that Stop the Killer Robots and others. I personally I've always felt that it's not pragmatic enough. Asking states to ground the drones and to stop drone warfare. It's just one of those things whereby the defense sector have invested, and it's quite a good tool to take out threats from afar. But in the same time, there comes a time in history where the norm contestation by these states and fighting in new ways and creating new laws and pressuring the legal systems and having a new way of fighting, you then normalize the entirety of it, and therefore everybody else is going to do it. So the genealogy of drone warfare, which started with Israel in 2000, then replicated by the US and thereafter the UK, and then we have France and others, including Turkey. And in the middle of that, you've had non-state armed groups, particularly in Syria, we've seen the use of drones, killing people, causing lots of hostilities, and the most sophisticated level of that we've seen in the Houthis in the north of Yemen, who have inflicted serious damage on infrastructure as well as armed and non-armed people. So now we have a situation where it's a normalized use of force, and Ukraine has effectively given the rubber stamp on that. And that should also be taken into account when we discuss drone warfare.
Thank you for that. I think to follow up, you spoke of obviously the genocide in Gaza, and I'd like to ask, how has drones been extensively used in this, brutal genocide that we've been watching over the past 15 months?
It's been used predominantly for surveillance and data grabbing and data acquisition. With the use of the drone, the new layer is AI, and I think Israel have taken it quite far with regards to its algorithmic warfare. And algorithmic warfare is effectively the utilization of their systems, such as Lavender. We may have heard of AI Lavender, or another system such as Hello Daddy. And these are data acquisition softwares based on AI, which predicts targets on the ground and may even follow a target if the units believe, if, for example, Unit 8200, which is responsible for target acquisition and striking, it to be a high value target, and they will call that Hello Daddy and literally follow them home. And then you have smaller tactical drones. So these are like the DCJI equivalent type drones we may use or you may see in your local park, people using for all sorts of things. So these smaller tactical drones are used particularly in irregular warfare or urban warfare settings. And they will go into like homes to see, who's there. And we've seen that, Israel have deployed them in a very inhumane ways where they're actually speaking to civilians, saying negative things, saying, hello, daddy, where's daddy, so on and so forth to children, which is, highly, inhumane, degrading treatment from the population, but also it shows you the way they treat the population in of itself. So that's how it's being used. And I think it's important to note that there's been many journalists which have been killed, which brings me back to the algorithmic warfare. As we know, throughout the entire live genocide, journalists have been uploading data online. So I'm talking about Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, their lives effectively of the genocide coverage. Whenever they do that, that goes somewhere and it goes into a cloud. So some of the professionals which I've been interviewing for a few years now, they call it the kill cloud. So that kill cloud, effectively where everything is controlled over that area, all the data is gone over there. And the military and the intelligence have a massive insight into that data. So they can use that data where, for example, a journalist uploads something on Instagram, find your location and strike. And that's what has been happening. So the anatomy of Israel's drone targeting is really interesting because they're using algorithmic warfare in their targeting now. And it's actually the first time we've seen that in the entirety of the genealogy of drone strikes and targeting.
Yeah, and I think following up on that, a lot of the terminology of these strikes gets obfuscated in military terminology, when someone enters discourse on drones, a lot of it has to do with purported discussions of security, civilian, non-civilian, so on and so forth. But in what can you outline more in depth who exactly is being targeted on a in this context by drones?
In the context of Gaza is interesting because when you have an occupation, the debate on who can be targeted lawfully or not becomes very murky. When you're looking at an entirety of a population which is under colonization, and in your targeting cycle of how you value the status of an individual, under the law, you look at whether they have hostile intent. Israel deem everyone in Gaza to have hostile intent. The proof is in the pudding. If you look at how they treat the entire population when they say go north and go south and they still get bombed, is because they believe everyone has hostile intent. Why? Because you're obviously, you're occupying them. And, as a general civilian, even if you were to follow orders, you're still going to be treated as someone who has hostile intent. And we've seen the way they target as well. If, for instance, there is a civilian who participates, the legal term is directly participating in hostilities. If there is anyone who does that, then you can be targeted to the point that you are actually DPH, directly participating in hostilities, supporting Hamas, for instance, in any shape or form. You can be targeted. The same goes for in any other theater. For example, in a war zone like Iraq or Afghanistan or another area. Outside of a war zone, it becomes more strenuous because the law of armed conflict doesn't necessarily apply. It will be international human rights law, and we'll be looking at a completely different framework, such as law enforcement. But what's really interesting is when we discuss the war on terror and the utilization of drone strikes by the Americans, by the UK, but also Israel, because they utilize the vernacular of counter-terrorism and national security in striking in the context of a colonial design of the anatomy of drone targeting, I think it's really important to look at the countering violent extremism. So we look at number one, countering violent extremism and how that has influenced targeting policies, especially against a population which they deem as inherently violent because of our views, because of what we believe in, so on and so forth. So the question is, and to come back to your original question, is i.e., who can be targeted? When you look at it through CVE, countering violent extremism, everyone's targetable in Gaza. And that's the reality. And we find that Western nation states are targeting us in this way. And we should pay particular attention to this. War jurists on both sides, in our own war rooms, and to understand how we are targeted. Because if we understand how we are targeted, it is better for us to then strategize in how we can resist lawfully within an armed conflict and also outside of an armed conflict. Because the reality is, it's not just the West who have the ability to strike, it's also us, Muslim nation states. We are also masters in jurisprudence in warfare. We have a rich tradition which has also influenced the Geneva Conventions and beyond. And that's just the surface of things with regards to warfare and Islam and things and how things should move forward.
Thank you so much for that. I want to understand the justifications, and I'm particularly thinking about the extrajudicial killings of Ismail Haniya in Iran and killing of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon. Because I saw the responses from the Western media in that it was a cause for celebration, but how are these attacks justified? Because there doesn't seem to be a hot war with these nations. On what is the rubric, or what are some of the justification and explanations that these people, the side that perpetrated it, so the Israelis, and with the help of the Western forces, how did they justify such attacks and killings?
Yeah, that's a good one. Israel justify well, first of all, they have an expansionist, the Greater Israel plan. The evidence is on their shoulders, right? We've all seen it. So
Yep.
they have an evidence of expanding their borders. And number two, they utilize the law strategically to justify their drone programs, their air power in particular, but also ground forces through very technical legal jargon. So they do it under self-defense, or they will say, for example, Lebanon is not fit enough to take care of non-state armed groups within its borders, and therefore, as a result, we need to intervene. And we're doing this under self-defense, under international law. And therefore, we have the right to go in there and deal with the threat. And that's how they justify it, to the extent that even if we were to take this to the US drone program, the lawfare they use after 9/11. So some papers call it the 9/11 law, or the US administration call it the Authorization for the Use of Military Force 2001 Act, AUMF. And they're going after Al Qaeda, Taliban, and then they have a term called associated forces. So that's the lawfare. So effectively, associated forces can be anyone who is an associated force of these entities. We will go after you. And that's what they've done in 7 different Muslim majority countries. So now you have drone programs of the Western world, including Israel, striking 7 different Muslim countries as and when they want. And it's not just according to a threat which is temporal. It's not like a temporal threat that they're justifying. It's actually one of colonialism. They're literally hovering around Muslim nation airspace, right? Left, right, and center for years on end in some case studies, like in Somalia, for instance, or in Yemen. And they're justifying it on this flimsy legal basis. And they're striking left, right, and center individuals, which then obviously leads on to civilian casualties. And these people, there have been no crime, no due process. There's been zero type of legal process to see whether they're innocent or not. They've been put on kill lists without even knowing they're on a kill list, number one. And everything that I'm saying here, there is a legal ramification too. It's a highly detailed conversation. We have extrajudicial killings taking place in all of these countries, which has been unfortunately normalized now.
Yeah, just to follow up on the legal ramifications, I mean, it would seem the argument that you're kind of outlining is that law follows obviously the colonialist imperialist goals of the political entities such as the Zionists and the Americans. So what are those ramifications for international law, which again many people would argue is fraught, especially in light of the genocide in Gaza, and the ramifications of the liberal conception of civilians as a concept?
Yeah, so I would say that from my research, the ramifications in the contents of Gaza is that everyone's targetable. There is no such thing as civilians who will not be targeted or be seen as hostile at the very least, because in the context of an occupation, and I consider it to be the entirety of Palestine to be occupied under our own standards of jurisprudence, not the liberal framework on international law, which is a completely different conversation. But then we are all targetable. And I think that's important to realize that when we are in warfare with the Western nation states, the way they will fight is they have an enabling posture. If we read the jurisprudence of the war jurists and their articles and how they justify, and I've spent a lot of time reading Zionist, jurists in particular, they do have a nuanced conversation. But towards the end of their assessment, they always say, well, it's an important discussion, but we have an enabling posture nonetheless to strike. And the entire reason is that there's a backdrop when it comes to drone warfare of total secrecy. You never get to see like who has been killed with a kill list. You never have any form of justice. There's been zero legal cases that have been successfully filed and prosecuted against individuals for unlawful killings in the global south, particularly Muslim majority countries. And we are going to be seeing the same off the back of this live genocide as we speak today, and is currently being discussed in Doha for a ceasefire. We are not going to find any form of recourse to justice when it comes to drone warfare. Moving forward, what I personally believe is that we should take note in the context of changing character of warfare, but also within our own jurisprudence. We need to be tactile and highly competitive against jurists of the Zionists, but also the Americans and the British, who believe, particularly the British, who believe that they can strike us even if there is no evidence of a threat of an armed attack, which is a completely novel legal position under international law. So we should take note of this, because that's the way we are being targeted, that's the way we are being killed. And the reality is we can't halt drones, but we need to be pragmatic about how to remain competitive and still have chivalry in the process.
Actually, Aden, you can go next and then I'll ask afterwards.
Yeah, I think on the conversation of how drones are being normalized, I'd like to ask, and I don't know to which depth you've researched this, but how do you see that, resistance movements or paramilitary forces such as, Hezbollah or forces in Iraq are using, drones in a different way to target necessarily the Zionist or American bases within the Middle East and so on and so forth? What does that add to the equation?
Yeah, I mean, in when we talk about non-state armed groups, and I'm talking about the liberal framework of international law, then yes, so non-state armed groups, and even if it's a state, then they will be acting quite lawfully by striking these targets. Also, based on the norm contestation by states, and according to their own values and systems, they believe that states have a higher degree to conduct in international law, and non-state armed groups and so on and so forth, they don't necessarily have the same level of kind of standards. So this is at the basic, the view within international law. But my view is that the conduct of non-state armed groups will never be accordance to a level of international law, which is a very high level. But in the same time, the assemblage we have with the conduct of state conduct in drone targeting in and of itself, and we've seen the ramifications of that in Gaza as of recent, is absolutely, madness. So if we can have that assemblage by the US, by the UK, by Israel, then we shouldn't expect the same for non-state armed groups. And off the back of that, I think it's important to understand that there are different codes of war that are taking place. So Israel have their own codes. They have their own systems of targeting their own religious war codes, but so does non-state armed groups and even states. I'm sure they have their own ways of understanding how to strike and so on and so forth, particularly in the context whereby international law in and of itself is failing, or the value to keep it going, and the risk of it diminishing is failing, particularly in the global south through a decolonial context. I think it's really important to understand that there are other legal systems, other civilizations, which can also have a take and a perspective on drone targeting in different theatres lawfully under their own codes and jurisprudence.
Thank you so much for that. Circling back, I never miss an opportunity to take a swipe at Obama. So I want to speak a little bit in closing about the kill lists. Oftentimes, we've heard about these kill lists. We've heard about this kind of week in and week out. Obama will be presented or the US president is presented with a list of names and then authorizes and sanctions killings against these folk. Do you mind just unpacking that a little bit of how that worked, or what did that even look like? What was, I guess, the scenario in which that took place?
Yes, indeed. It's a very good question, and it's an important one also. And I'll bring it back to Gaza as well. So the U.S. drone programs kill lists with an intersection of the UK. So whenever we discuss, the US, we're also discussing the UK because they never do it alone. As a strategy. So the underlying strategy is the disposition matrix, which is a complex grid of suspect terrorists, quote unquote, to be traced and then targeted in drone strikes or captured for interrogation. And we've seen that in the last 20 years of the war on terror across these countries. But the main thing to take note of is the disposition matrix. So they have a list via law enforcement and intelligence agencies where they may go after certain high value targets. After about 10 to 15 years of the war on terror, we found out that it's not just high value targets. It's actually many different types of people. So it's not just like people who are military, but it's also non-military people which are being targeted. And I remember when I was very young, back in 2001, 2002, they used to, the American news used to use the baseball cards whenever someone was killed. And then they used to cross it out like it was some sort of a game. And whilst I could understand why they were going out doing it, and I always knew that they had this Hollywood type of, kind of expressing themselves in any type of, feeling or contextualizing their warfare, even in that way. But I found it interesting that they would kind of dehumanize in that way, and we would never really know who these faces actually are. So when I was doing my investigations, it became very clear that I don't even think the Americans knew who they were targeting half the time. And then eventually, when I spoke to a group of 5 to 6, U.S. drone pilots, they also confirmed the same. So the reality is they don't know who they're targeting, but they have a few people on the list that they are going after, which is shared between powers such as the UK. And the UK have also put people on lists, including British individuals, and they go through kill capture scenarios. So they either killed or they captured. Now, the problem is Obama and Bush administration put a lot of people in Guantanamo Bay. And then I think Obama realized that this strategy is not going to support him. And after all, he was a constitutional lawyer and it looks bad on him. Nonetheless, I think he suffered from some amnesia. So he went, ahead to kill people left, right, and center. And that didn't quite work for him either, because then once you've killed the people in their thousands, for example, in Pakistan, which is outside of a conflict zone, it looks even worse for you. So he only had one option to go with the program and the game that he's playing, the playbook that he has created effectively, and say that it's all lawful. And it's interesting because the British government have the same, and it's subject to my thesis. In fact, the entirety of my thesis is called the British Drone Matrix, where I look at the intersection of counter-terrorism practices domestically, so in the UK, suspects in the UK, and how they are then transferred and pushed out subject to disenfranchisement strategies and tactics and abuse effectively and violence, and coerced out and then shifted to global south countries and then taken out under the entire paradigm and pretext of counterterrorism. So they go from like a domestic counterterrorism strategy all the way to a more violent one, a lethal one, drone targeting. So some of these countries, for example, the UK, they don't necessarily have a death penalty, but they actually have a neo-medieval death penalty or exile and banish and kill strategy. And that's what I write about and evidence empirically, including the kill list shared between both powers.
Thank you so much for such a detailed conversation. I really appreciate it. It was super insightful. I definitely learned so much, and I'm sure the listeners will be grateful to have this explanation done so accessible. And I think fundamentally you underscored for us the sentiments and analysis of the likes of Frantz Fanon, in that colonialism is such a violent, sadistic, brutal and irrational. It's not a thinking system, right? So thank you once again, brother. It's been an honor and privilege. I highly recommend people engage with the work of Khalil. I will leave Khalil's socials in the episode description. And until next time, people, peace out.